Welcome. You're watching Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Salim and Adofo. Today we have on the show Dr. Carr, who is part of an organization called the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. We want to welcome Dr. Carr. How you doing, sir?
Good, brother. Good to see you again.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
One of the things I want to talk about today is history. So I think the best place for us to start off with is Black History Month.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us the history of Black History Month, please?
Okay. What we call Black History Month now began as Negro History Week in 1926. It was the brainchild of a brother who was born and raised in Virginia, now West Virginia, named Carter Godwin Woodson. Okay. Carter Woodson, and we can talk more about who Woodson was,
yes,
kind of thing. But he designed this to be a week during the year. And of course, 1926, we're talking about segregated schools for black folks. Right. This was what he called a brief period during the year when black people, and Negro children, as he would call them then, and their teachers, could display what they had learned about the Negro during the rest of the year. Okay. So instead of being the only time that we talk about Black history, this was the time when people exhibited what they had learned at that time, the other 51 weeks. And then around 1968, 1969, it was expanded to a month. His organization that he founded in 1915, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, pushed for this. And now we have the entire month of February. Okay. And of course, he picked February, the week in February that became a month, because he said during this week, the country celebrated two birthdays, which kind of showed the frame. One, the birth of Frederick Douglass, who picked February for his birthdays. He didn't know the day, so he picked February. And the other, Abraham Lincoln. So he said that's why February was picked. It kind of was a myth. They gave us, first of all, they didn't give us anything. Right. Number two, it was picked for a strategic purpose, and that's why Woodson did it. Okay, so Dr. Woodson had a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And I'm gonna read a quote from that book. It says, "When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You need not to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no door, he will cut one for his special benefit. His education makes it necessary." Yes. What does that mean? Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. When Woodson wrote that book, the book started as a series of essays. Okay. He collected them, and these essays were written in the wake of the Great Depression of 1929. So over the 1930s, 1931, 2, 3. Woodson was basically commenting on what he viewed as a real challenge facing black people during that period. The challenge was for us to think for ourselves, build our own institutions, and not rely on other people. And he tied that directly to what he would characterize as miseducation, or beginning to think of ourselves through the perspectives of other people, in that case, white America. And, you know, if you think like a slave, you will behave like a slave. And I think that's what Woodson is saying in that quote. In other words, you won't think you're supposed to go through the front door. You've been trained to go through the back door. And if you go around back and there's no door, you saying, well, give me an axe. Why? I got to cut a back door. Why? Because I was educated to believe I'm not supposed to even go through the front door. I'm not even supposed to be in this building. So Woodson understood that education is really the key to one's humanity.
That's a good point. And I'm going to tell you another quote. Malcolm X has stated, "Of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward all research." Absolutely. What does he mean by that?
Absolutely. Well, history is memory. Okay. I mean, if we think about history as human memory, then we understand that memory is what separates humanity from every other living organism. Animals react through instinct. Human beings have memory. So, I mean, a metaphor people often use is the goldfish. Human beings look at a goldfish in a bowl and say, oh, that poor goldfish. But what they don't understand is the goldfish has no memory. So the goldfish is swimming around, and every time it swims around, it's like the first time they're swimming around. But a human being would go crazy, right? Look, this is the 15th time. Why? Because you have memory. What Malcolm is saying is that as you recover your memory, you are being rewarded with an extended sense of yourself in time and space. Your humanity is expanding. Of all the disciplines, history is the one that is best prepared to reward our research, because you're adding, literally, you're adding lifetimes to your own lifetime. And in the other direction, you're adding to your imagination. What is possible? As Marcus Garvey said, what people have done, people can do. So people say, oh man, black people ain't never, hold on. The more history you realize, wait a minute, we created pyramids? Yeah, wait a minute, we dammed rivers and created, we built great civilizations. So why are my pants hanging off? Or I don't know. You answer that question. Okay, let me pull my pants up. Right, because history has rewarded your research. You now have a different vision of possibility because you have a better memory.
Why is there such a struggle to remove black people from their history?
Oh, well, I think that's fairly straightforward. When you remove people from their memory, you can implant what you need them to do in their minds. And that's what Woodson was really talking about.
Okay.
I mean, John Henry Clark, one of our great historians, said, if you start your history with slavery, everything since then looks like progress. So, there's an African-American president. Right. That's great until you compare him to every other woman and man who has led nations, at which point you realize Barack Obama doesn't make the top 100,000 of black leaders if you're talking about 10,000 years of history. Right. But if you start your history with we never had a black president, then this looks like progress. The deliberate attempt to separate black people from their memory, which isn't just an American phenomenon, is what the great Kenyan writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, calls dismemberment. He says the dismemberment of Africa took place in two stages. One was the physical separation of Africans from the continent, and the other one, which he said is enduring and continues, is the deliberate separation of memory from the black subject. So we're not supposed to think about Africa. We're not supposed to think about any connection. However, we're not supposed to question when at a police funeral, a bunch of people show up in bagpipes. Why are y'all blowing bagpipes? Well, this is a tradition that Irish. Yeah, but you're not Irish. Okay, so I'm gonna put this red, black, and red. What are y'all making up that black history again? Wait a minute. Why don't we get to do it? Because the minute you begin to connect through history is the minute you begin to look at the world differently. And one thing that this world has been built on, the labor of African people, has required African people to see themselves first as laborers and contribution and contributors to another society, not as connected to each other.
One of the things I look at is a lot of times when sisters and brothers, are murdered in our community, you go down the corner and you'll see balloons, you see bottles of liquor, and you see pictures. Yes. And I'm saying to myself, that looks like a shrine.
It is a shrine.
And they'll have these beverages here, and I'm saying that's, I'll pour 40 out in the memory of somebody. That's a libation.
That's right.
And I'm saying that's African history.
Absolutely.
Right there. Those are African rituals. Absolutely. But yet we don't even know it.
No, and it's interesting. Culture often is what you do when you don't remember what to do. It's been so deeply ingrained in your rituals that you do it without thinking. Here, of course, one of the books that you have folks studying, Robert Farris Thompson, Flash of the Spirits. He wrote a book. He put together a book called Altars of the Atlantic. Okay. And what you see on those corners when someone has been murdered is a shrine. You bring together some of the person's favorite things. You bring together elements that bring joy and life, like flowers or stuffed animals. You bring together a picture of that person, and then you light candles for the ancestral presence. Well, you see that in Salvador Bahia at Candomblé shrines. You see it with Santeria in Cuba. You see it with Macumba in Cuba. You see it in Vodun, where it be Haiti or the South Side Chicago or New York City or Philly. These rituals bring together memory, and that's what Africans do. That's what people do.
But why are people so anti-history? Oh, that was that stuff in the past, that's slavery, let's move on. These are the common things that I hear, not all black people say, but a large number of black people say. And I look at other cultures and other nationalities, and they seem to embrace their history.
Absolutely.
And then by them embracing their history, they seem to be in a better position economically.
Oh, no, absolutely. Well, it's interesting. And this is what Woodson was writing about in the Miseducation of the Negro. A great deal of that book is about self-determination in every way, from economics to politics, but it begins with history and culture. Mm-hmm. So rituals, for example. Rituals are reinforcements of memory. Here in the Washington, D.C. area, for example, D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, we have the Arlington National Cemetery, much of which started as Freedmen's Village. The whole place actually started as a plantation. Martha Washington's descendants began, and then of course Robert E. Lee's descendants got involved. But the point is this, every Memorial Day, people take flowers out to the cemetery. What are you doing? We are remembering the ancestors. And you see black people, every time I go to Arlington, the grave of Medgar Evers, the grave of Joe Louis, grave of Thurgood Marshall. These are heroes of African people that we go and remember. People don't have a problem with that.
No.
But when there's too much blackness, it becomes a problem. Why? Because now you have exerted yourself in a way that may disturb the social arrangement. And what Woodson is saying in the Miseducation of the Negro is people will train you to be slaves because you are of service to them. When you begin thinking for yourself, you may disturb that service and that social order, which is why they will continue to train you never to think of yourself collectively, because the illusion is that you can never do for yourself. The reality is, once we do for ourselves, this whole condition will change. And that's the thing that people are afraid of in power.
One of the things you touched on was the acknowledgement of ancestors.
Yes.
And I see people condemn, African people in America, or they say even Africans on the continent throughout the world, ancestral worship, and they say it in such a negative context. But if you go to some of these cities, you see statues of some of these folks. You see streets named after people. They have days that people get off from work for some of these folks. Parks, all of these things, in my mind, are ways to commemorate an ancestor. Is that not ancestral worship? Absolutely.
In fact, it's interesting, people who say that, there are a couple of things. One very simple thing, you say exactly what you said, street signs and street names. Consider the city of Los Angeles. The city of angels. Why? Because this is a city where the Spanish came in, and every street you see them name, they name for a saint. Wow. So Los Angeles is the city of angels. I mean, it's a shrine city. Washington, D.C. is a shrine city. In fact, when I lived in Philly, I used to tell the students at Howard when I would travel, I said, every morning I get up in the city where they made up America, and I travel to the city they made up for America. They drugged Washington, D.C. out of a swamp and made it into a shrine. And every time you go around DuPont Circle, every time you go around the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial, you are reinforcing ancestral veneration. And now, when we go down to the Martin Luther King Memorial, I love to go down there in the evening and watch elders and children come down there. Black people just drawn to that space. Why? It's a rock. No, this is a shrine. This is our ancestor. Regardless of how he got to come here, it's our ancestor. It's very interesting to see.
Yeah, Marcus Garvey said a tree cannot grow without its roots.
That's right.
And I look at our history. Our history just isn't Black history. I look at it as world history.
That's right. That's right.
We are some of the first people on this planet to do. If it's been done, we probably did it.
Yes. I'm glad you raised that. It's funny because Woodson wrote this. He wrote this shortly before he died in 1950. He talked about the meaning of Negro History Week during that. He said, what we're talking about is not a history of the Negro, but the Negro in history. He said, if you just tell history straight, we need no special pleading. Woodson said, the case of the Negro is well made if you just tell the history. John Clark, coming out of Alabama, traveling to New York, went to see Arturo Schomburg, the great African Puerto Rican scholar, right? And he asked Schomburg, teach me the history of Black people. And Schomburg, Clark said to him, son, what you're talking about Black history is the missing pages of world history. Once you study your history, you'll find out where you were left out. And then you begin to understand why you were left out. Because you're right. If it happened in history, you're probably going to find Black people at the beginning of it. In all ways, love, peace, war, destruction. Black people at the beginning. Why? Because Africans are the first people on the planet.
All right. We're here with Dr. Greg Carr, member of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. We'll be right back.
Kids, here we are at the slavery exhibit. Now, as you can see, the slaves were kidnapped from their homes, chained together for weeks. They would cram them onto these ships in very appalling conditions.
Thousands of women and children are being smuggled across the border.
Sexual trafficking of children. As you can see right here, they were treated like animals. They worked all day long for no pay.
In sweatshops raided by police, children forced into slave labor.
Some of the slave masters were very cruel. They whipped them and they beat them, as you can see in some of these pictures.
Torture and assault can be brutal, even fatal.
So, before moving on, are there any questions?
Does this still happen today?
Welcome back to Sankofa Community Affairs with our brother Salim Adofo. We're here with Dr. Carr. He's a member of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, ASCAC for short. Dr. Carr, can you tell us about ASCAC?
Yes, the association came into existence in 1984 at a conference in Los Angeles. It was a conference that was pulled together by leading figures in the study of African history, mostly from the United States, but also internationally, who thought that it was important for us to pull together people who have been doing this work for years. You had major figures like Jacob Carruthers from the Kemetic Institute in Chicago, Dr. Yosef Ben-Yakinen and John Henry Clark from New York, Dr. Malana Karenga from Los Angeles, and other folks, Dr. Asa Hilliard from Atlanta, and Dr. Leonard Jeffries from New York, who kind of came together. And so you had hundreds of people come together in LA. The following year, they decided to meet again in Chicago, and it was that year that the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations was founded. The association has 4 commissions: an education commission to help write curriculum and develop lessons for the study of African history, a research commission grounded in the study of ancient Kemet or Egypt, but also all civilizations of African people in the world, a spiritual development commission to deal with this question of rituals and just this question of how we pull together Black people spiritually, and then finally a creative productions commission, which allows us to think about how we create music and song and dance and drama to promote. Those 4 commissions operate throughout not only the United States, but the Caribbean. We have chapters in Africa and Europe as well, England and France in particular. And we've tried to do work over these 30 years now since the founding of the association.
So some of those brothers and sisters that you named have done extraordinary work. And in my mind, they've challenged the traditional notions of, white society, white history, white supremacy, by stating actually what you're saying is actually the opposite.
Yes.
They're saying that Black people were uncivilized, they needed to be educated, so forth and so on, and white people had all of the information and knowledge. But they've actually been able to prove otherwise.
Absolutely. And one of the things that ASCAC doesn't try to be all things to all people. And as you've proven with NBUF, we need to have organizations. And then once we have organizations, we need to network with each other. ASCAC has carved out the real study of classical African civilizations as its foundation, saying this is one thing we can contribute. So, for example, Jacob Carruthers, who is the first person of African descent born in this country to have mastered the study of ancient Egyptian language. And those who were his contemporaries and students, Rickety Wemby and Roosevelt Roberts, Yvonne Jones, Mario Beatty, Andreas Woods, and others. Now, we can translate the ancient Egyptian texts. And of course, what you saw at ASCAC as well was the bringing in of the towering figure who remains with us, Theophilo Benga, who is an ASCAC member. And of course, he was a protege of Sheikh Anta Diop. This interdisciplinary study of Africa allows us to rewrite our own history. And as you said, there's so many figures. Listervelt Middleton, the great, you're continuing in his tradition with this broadcast. I mean, the man who brought this stuff to people in South Carolina through public access television. Great thinkers across the range, Marimba Ani, the great cultural theoretician, Wade Nobles, the great psychologist. I mean, the idea is that as you study yourself, you can transform your reality. And ASCAC has taken it on as its responsibility, helping to move that along through a dedicated research in African civilizations.
One of the brothers that you mentioned earlier was Dr. Leonard Jeffries.
Yes.
And he caught hell.
Yes.
And
gave hell.
Gave hell. Because one of the things he stated was that the Europeans were ice people and the African people were people of the sun.
Yes.
What did he mean by that?
Well, it's interesting. He caught hell for that remark, but I think that was more politics than anything.
Okay.
Frankly, because the person who really began to advance that thesis was a white Canadian by the name of Michael Bradley. Yeah, Michael Bradley wrote a book called The Iceman Inheritance. Exactly right. Where he says that temperament is often shaped culturally by geography. Okay. Those who deal with human geography may agree to a point, or they may disagree, but this much is clear. Sheikh Anta Diop, in his oeuvre of work, talks about different cradles of culture. Where you have resource scarcity, you have different cultures emerge. So the cultures of Northern Europe, where there may have been short resources and the seasons are different, the weather is different, you have families that are contracted. People call them nuclear families. I may say it's contracted family. Because check out, a joke would say the closer you get to the equator, the more resources you have, the more people you're able to feed, or the more people you can put to work. You might have what people would call extended families in the Western model, but we might just call them families. No, there are families and constricted families. Your constricted family is based on your resources. Leonard Jeffries simplified that by giving this ice people, sun people thesis as a kind of provocation to consider how geography may dictate some of the fundamental elements of culture. But of course, we live in a society where people don't read. People want to see something in 15 seconds. Right. And people want to align themselves against Africans thinking for themselves. So immediately, of course, that became fodder for derision.
Right. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. You said that The Iceman Inheritance was a book written by someone of European descent.
Yeah.
Now, there's another book, I can't even call this a book. There's just a whole nother world that was written by Dr. Marimba Ani called Yurugu. An African-centered critique of European culture and thought.
Yes.
Now, in my mind, Michael Bradley's trying to critique Europeans, but I think he's critiquing them from a European standpoint.
Yes.
And many other black folks critique Europeans based upon a European dynamic.
Yes.
But in Yurugu, Dr. Marimba Ani is critiquing Europeans based upon African standards.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, it's interesting because two of the leading critics of Europe, to help us think through this and begin to kind of disassociate ourselves culturally in some ways, have been women. You know, the great pioneer Frances Cress Welsing, of course, who begins to look at the European psyche, using initially Freud and then branching out, and of course Marimba Ani. That book, Yurugu, that monster of a book, began actually as her doctoral dissertation for the New School in New York. The Demystification of European Thought was its initial working title. She then shifts, as you said, into this African-grounded critique of European culture using the Dogon.
Right.
And the idea of Onomo, the idea of Yurugu, the partnerless twin who now roams the world creating chaos. She uses African archetypes to deal with this question of culture. What is the seed of a culture? The Udamawazo or the Udamarojo? What is the ethos of a culture? And how has Europe engaged in a cultural offensive against not just African people, but the world? She takes it back to Aristotle. She looks at Plato, the question of the rhetorical ethic, the idea that you can say something in debate in order to win a debate and it doesn't have to be true. This is a European concept. You're not going to see that other places. That's why even today, in the ancient Egyptian, you would say medu. Medu means speech, but it also refers to how you behave. Nefer means beautiful, but it isn't beauty in appearance, it's beauty in behavior. So somebody in contemporary African culture in the United States might say, she looks pretty, but she acts ugly. You can't understand that from a European because beauty is about how you look. No, beauty is how you act. Beauty is, and somebody say word is bond, meaning what? You can't say that to me if it's not true.
Right.
But if you're a lawyer in the European sense, you can say whatever you want because what's your objective? My objective is not the truth. My objective is to get you off. In Yurugu, what Marimba Ani examines is the genealogy of that kind of thinking. So you're absolutely right. It's an African-centered critique of Europe.
I think a lot of times that, we look at these classical civilizations and we don't really put them into context. We look at them as just, okay, well, that's just something back there. What relevance does that have? And I take something like the Sankofa bird, for example. And in that bird, its head is bent backwards and it's holding an egg. And I think that the egg, to me, symbolizes our history. If you hold it too tight, what happens to an egg? It cracks.
That's right.
If you hold our history too tight, you go back to the golden age of West Africa, we're not going back.
That's right.
I don't care how great Mali was.
That's right.
Timbuktu, we're not going back there.
Not going back.
But if you hold it too loose, you drop it and it breaks.
That's right.
And I look at that today as somebody, like Lil Wayne, who makes a song like Beat It Up like Emmett Till.
Emmett Till, right.
He doesn't have an understanding of our struggle and our legacy and what Emmett Till and his family and other people went through as a result of that.
That's right.
So I think that's the importance of the study of, our history.
That's right. Not just for Africans, for everyone in the world. It's interesting to me when we talk about this and people say, well, black people, why are y'all trying to go back in the past? You can't go back in the past. We know that. Every human being knows that. So why is there a Library of Congress? Why do you seek the Gutenberg Bibles and put them on display so much? Don't you have a more recent Bible? You can't read that anyway. No, the point is that you always remember. Because memory is what frames one's continuing work and to be human. rituals reinforce memory. So the idea that Africans should be deprived of rituals of memory is absurd, and no one can defend it. Somebody says, well, why y'all studying the past? Let me ask you a question. At the end of May, why do people put on monastic robes when it's hot outside and go to a graduation? Why? Because that is where you trace the history of European Academy. Now, if we decided to take those robes off and come marching in African boobas and having drummers and dancers, you would say you black people have made this up. Oh, come on. You remember when it's important. We should be able to do the same. In fact, if we don't do it, then we're going to fall subject to this type of miseducation that Carter Woodson was talking about.
You know, one of the things I can appreciate about ASCAC is that the element of incorporating a lot of young people. Some of my friends are members of, of ASCAC,
yes.
and I get to see them prepare for months
Yes.
on submitting papers, doing their
Yes.
presentations, and I'm saying, you know what, this is scholarship.
Yes.
It's learning way before you even get a chance to present.
Oh,
you
no
gotta
question.
reference, cross-reference, and they're saying, well, I got to impress these elders.
Yes.
So they know they can't come with no garbage.
Yes. And I'm glad you said it, because the young people who you work with, who are faithful NBUF members who organize, many of them also ASCAC members. That's because ASCAC has a dual kind of objective in its work. Number one is to prepare people to do that kind of research. But number two, which is really, it's just one purpose, you prepare in order to be a resource. Correct. So you're not in ASCAC and not in NBUF. No, you're not supposed. No, that's not how it works. Your job is to be a person who people can rely on to continue and to do this research. And so, I'm glad to hear you say that, because that's the way it's supposed to work.
Well, one of the things I was always told is that Dr. Clark, Dr. John Harold Clark, bless his soul, was doing research for Malcolm.
Absolutely. Yeah, he would say that. He said, the OAAU.
Right.
He says, they drew up the blueprint for the OAAU. They meeting at my house. We over here talking about this. He said Malcolm would come through and say, I need a folder on this. I need a folder on this subject. And John Clark would help do the research. And
I know during the early days of the National Black United Front, Baba Jacob Carruthers was part of the research team.
Absolutely.
That the National Black United Front had.
For the great one himself, the great Conrad Worrell, who is nothing else is a researcher or an organizer.
And I think that is good operational unity. Yes. I know at one point in time we had sisters and brothers in Kansas City that had the African Centered Education Collegiate Campus, and many members of ASCAC helped with the development of the curriculum.
Absolutely.
You had elements of the school that were named after Dr. Asa Hilliard.
That's right.
So I think that scholarship and activism, to me, go hand in hand.
They do. They do.
If I'm studying the past, I need to be able to take the best of what's in the past and use it moving forward.
That's
but
right.
I can't continue to use some of those tactics.
That's
but at
right.
the same time, and to me, Dr. Jeffries is a great example. Although he's never had a book, he would sit there and tell you that you can't make the history and write it.
That's true. Although I think he's being a little modest, because Jeffries has written, Jeffries has published, but you're right. This is critical. We have to think about it. There is a seamless whole. We have to work together. But you're right. Jeffries is a perpetual organizer.
Yes, sir.
But he has living publications in terms of everybody he's affected.
Dr. Carr, we have run out of time. Can you please tell everybody how they can get in touch with ASCAC?
Sure. We have a website, ascacfoundation.org. You can just Google ASCAC and you'll see ASCAC. And then, we have an annual conference. And so you can then keep up with us there. And you can follow us on Twitter. We have some other things. But start with the website.
Okay, we want to thank you for coming on.
Thank you, brother.
And you are watching Sankofa Community Affairs with Brother Salim Adofo. We appreciate you. Thank you. Take some time to go read about your history. Peace.